I do this stuff because apparently I'm talking to myself. Okay. I do this stuff because I feel it's so necessary to teach people how intricately the scriptures are tied together. And when we have our Circle Sundays like we do, and I get feedback from you guys about where you're reading or what something might be tough to understand, I begin to look for examples that I can give you that I can take an obscure story and I can link it in to some other places. And while I was listening to the word this morning, I came through Psalms, .52, which obviously the beginning of Psalms 52 says, to the chief musician, a contemplation of David when Doeg, the Edomite, went out and told Saul and said to him, David is gone to the house of Ahimelech. And, you know, if you're reading through the Psalms in your daily devotional life and you read that first verse, you're probably going, okay, like, what does that have to do with anything? And I just wanted to take a journey with you to show you how the scripture links together and why in your study time you don't constrain yourself to one portion of scripture. Give yourself the opportunity to read everything, even if you don't understand it. And then when you have those questions, you know, you were part of a church where you get to ask questions. You have online ways of reaching us. You have Circle Sundays to reach us. You can pick up the phone and ask your question. And the funny thing is, and I know I say this when we're on our Circle Sundays all the time, but I haven't really said it in a session. Growing up, that was not the experience that my family had when it came to the pastors that were in our lives. If we had deep questions about the scriptures, we consistently wound up stumping our spiritual leadership. And it's not to say that a pastor has to know everything, or am I saying that I know everything? I hope I never know everything about the scriptures, because I always want to be surprised about what else there is to learn. But at the same time, there was almost always an animosity when it came to asking questions, because behind it there was an embarrassment that you were exposing a lack of knowledge, if that makes any sense. And that was something that we endured under different churches and different administrations, and it was kind of sad. In this place, whether you're online or you're here with our local congregation, you can send a message, send an email, pick up a phone, you can ask your questions, and we are here to answer your questions. But one of the reasons that I just think it's so necessary to tie different scriptures together is to give people a comprehensive knowledge of the Word, and then in so doing, help you understand some of the lessons that God is teaching through His Word that we might not see if we just read the surface of the story. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm setting out to do in this session, and I saw this opportunity. What I want you to do is go to Leviticus chapter 24. Michelle is not even going to try to keep things on the screen because I don't know how fast I have to get to where I'm going right now, and I'm going to bounce all over. Leviticus 24, verse 5. Leviticus 24, verse 5. But we are going to be going to Matthew 12 in just a moment. I think it's Matthew 12. Yeah, Matthew 12:1. And then we'll also be going to 1 Samuel 21. So you can keep your fingers in those places. All right. So Leviticus 24 is giving instructions for the furnishings of the tabernacle. And we have come to, and we've just completed our second episode of our show. In that I use a model of the tabernacle for a little bit. So when you see that, you'll get a visual of what I'm talking about. But there were different furnishings. There were furnishings in the outer court, like the brazen altar and the brass basin where the priests were to wash. And then there were obviously the furnishings in the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat and the cherubim that rested upon it. But there were also furnishings in the holy place, which was the kind of the middle room, if you will, of the tabernacle. And there you had the 7-branched lampstand, the menorah, and you had a golden table that was called the table of showbread. And every week, the priests had to bake 12 loaves of bread, stack them in 2 rows, which I'll describe here in a minute, and then they were to leave that there, that bread, and the 12 loaves of bread spoke to the 12 tribes of Israel, okay? And they were to be in the presence of the Lord where the priests were ministering. So that's what we're talking about in this verse. I just want to give you a little heads up so I wasn't kind of coming at it out of nowhere. Verse 5 says, "And you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. You shall set them in 2 rows, 6 in a row, on the pure gold table before the Lord. And you shall put frankincense on each row, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, an offering made by fire to the Lord. Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel as an everlasting covenant." So the children of Israel had to offer the grain in order to make the flour. To do this, the priest had to set 12 loaves before the Lord in the light of the menorah that was on the way to the Holy of Holies, where the high priest once a year sprinkled blood on the Day of Atonement. And then verse 9 says, "And it shall be for Aaron," meaning Moses' brother, "and his sons," a.k.a. the priestly line, because if you're familiar at all with the way it works, all Levites, the descendants of Jacob's son Levi, they were set aside as a special tribe. They didn't get an inheritance, right? And they were given 6 cities. And then from the Levitical line, because Aaron was a Levite, the Levites were decided to be priests. So all Levites ministered to the Lord, but not all Levites were priests. All priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. So for Aaron and his son, they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him from the offerings of the Lord made by fire by a spiritual statute. So the way this showbread worked is every week on the Sabbath, they baked 12 new loaves. They set them there. The old loaves, it was like the initiation of like the day-old baked goods, right? They were taken out, and then the priests and their sons, they had to eat the loaves in a holy place. And I looked it up. Frankincense actually can be eaten. In fact, it's frankincense and myrrh can both be eaten. It's often chewed like gum in some of those cultures. I told Brian this morning, you've heard of Frank's Red Hots. I'm going to start my own company that's just Frank's Incense. You'll get that when you go home. So this is the concept of what we're doing here Levitically. It was a perpetual sacrifice by the Lord to symbolize the entire nation of Israel being represented by this bread, okay? That was spiritual to the Lord. Now, go to Matthew chapter 12. And we're going to go here to see what Jesus says about this before we get into the heartbeat of our story this morning. I'm not doing the typical preachment of these verses, but I just want to see where you're going. So here we go. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read?" And again, this is one of those amazing cases where Jesus says to the scribes, the actual transcribers, probably some of the only literate people in Israel, he says, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" Meaning they did the work. They continued to do sacrifice on the Sabbath. And yet even though there was a commandment to not do work on the Sabbath, they were blameless. They continued to do it because they were obeying the spirit of the law. He says, "Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, and not sacrifice, Jesus quoting Hosea 6:6, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And the point that Jesus is making here is that God created the Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath, the rest, the day of rest, was created to give man rest, not to put legalistic rules on top of him in order to cause him more stress, more chaos. It was to give him a day to rest from all that. And the Pharisees, in their typical fashion, they were being very legalistic about how they applied this. Okay, so that's the New Testament lesson, and Jesus is drawing from something that David did. The focus of our time in this session, I want to spend talking about that story, about what David did, because what David did, he didn't even necessarily go about it in the best of ways. David was a man after God's own heart, but he was a smarty pants sometime, and he got himself out of some sticky situations by doing some interesting things. And because we had a discussion the last time we were together on Circle Sunday about 1st and 2nd Samuel and how some of those stories are hard to tie in their value, I wanted to be able to do this. So go now to 1 Samuel, as I laid down that context, and go now to 1 Samuel chapter 21. This is the story that Jesus was referencing. Make sure I don't want to. Now, just prior to this, David was warned by King Saul's son, Jonathan, David's best friend, that Saul was out to kill him. And so David has run and has gone into exile. And it says, now David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. So we're now dealing with somebody from the priestly line. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? So David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has ordered me on some business and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. So I've directed my young men to such and such a place. Okay, so David is actually fleeing from the king. He's not on a black ops mission for King Saul. He is running away, and David delves into a little bit of intrigue here because his men and him, they're all under threat of death because this unrighteous King Saul is insane, and he's trying to kill David out of jealousy. And David has told his men to go away, but David is a man of renown and a man of reputation, and he's there by himself. I mean, Saul was known as a man who killed his thousands. David was known as a man who killed his 10,000s. And if you didn't know David in a personal way, had you met him alone in a dark alley, you might actually think if he was by himself, he might not be up to any good. You might be, if you were just a normal priest, a tad bit intimidated. He's a celebrity who is known for killing people. Put yourself in those shoes. So David comes up with this story to tell Ahimelech while he's there. And then he reveals the reason why he's come to the priest. He says, now therefore, what have you on hand? See, they're in exile, they're running, they had to flee quickly, they don't have any provisions. He says, give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. What he's saying is the only bread that we have here is the showbread. The only bread that I have to give you is the bread that we've just taken off of the table of showbread in the Holy of Holies. It's a week old, and it's only meant for the priest to eat. But you seem like you're in a dire situation, so at least if the men have kept themselves for women, then you can eat it. And now you can see that what Jesus was saying is have you not heard, have you not read that David took bread that was meant only for the priest, and when there was a dire need, he took it, even though it was unlawful, and he fed it to his men, and yet you're condemning my disciples for eating just heads of grain as they walk through, because as we all know from the story of Ruth, it was perfectly legal, according to Leviticus law, for people to glean the corners of the fields. That was how the welfare system worked in ancient Israel. The owners of the fields weren't even allowed to harvest their entire field. They had to leave a portion of it back so that the homeless could come and work to gather grain to have for themselves. That was part of what God established for Israel. And that's, in effect, what the disciples were doing. And the Pharisees loved to talk about how righteous David was, because David was the king according to the promise. David was supposed to be the heir, or the progenitor of the Messiah. They always talked about David. In fact, that's why they got so annoyed when Jesus used as one of his titles that he was the son of David, because that was a pretentious claim to the throne of Israel at a time when Israel had no king. In fact, they had an Edomite king, a wannabe king, right? And so Jesus turns it around on the Pharisees and says, David wasn't condemned for doing something that was actually unlawful, because you don't understand what Hosea 6:6 says, which is, I desire mercy in not sacrifice. In other words, the true character of God was to be merciful and not legalistic, right? Not tolerant of sin, there's a difference. David wasn't sinning. He was eating bread that was rightful to eat, but he wasn't technically of the right class to eat it, but a priest gave it to him. Now, it's interesting, too, because in David's time, if there were religious elite in his day, people could have said that he shouldn't have ever been anointed king, because his great-great-great-great-great-grandma, Ruth, was a Moabite woman. And a Moabite woman, according to Leviticus law, was never supposed to be married into the people of Israel. But again, the whole story of the book of Ruth is that what the law couldn't do, grace did. And she was brought into the kingdom of Israel. She proselytized and said, your God will be my God. And she was purchased by the kinsman redeemer, Boaz. She was purchased and redeemed through that marriage, just like Jesus purchases us through the marriage to the church. And she was allowed to be a part of something that the law never would have allowed, mercy rather than sacrifice. In fact, David wouldn't have even qualified had that not been the case. So verse 5 says, then David answered the priest and said to him, truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day. So, in other words, it was holy, but it is actually now just common bread because you've replaced it. You're not taking the holy bread off the table of showbread to give it to us. This is the old bread. So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there, but the showbread, which had been taken from him before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place on the day that it was taken away. Now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day. Pay attention to this part. Detained before the Lord. And his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. Some say that translation is the chief of the runners. He was an errand boy for the king. And David said to Ahimelech, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. So here's David selling a story. He had to leave so fast he doesn't even have a weapon. And in the distance, one of King Saul's lackeys overhears what's going on. And now we know a couple things about this guy named Doeg. He was an Edomite. See, King Herod was also an Edomite. Edomites mean instead of descending from Jacob, they descended from Esau, because Esau became the head of the kingdom of Edom. And there is something that today is called the eternal hatred, where there is still an animosity in the world today between Israel and the descendants of Esau. And there are prophecies that we haven't gotten into yet that suggest there will be yet future conflicts between these two groups. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the Zealots in Jesus' time had such a problem with the Roman Empire, is the Romans had put in place over Israel an Edomite king, a non-Jewish king who was in fact claiming to be a Jewish king. And it was that Edomite king who made all the embellishments to Ezra and Nehemiah's temple that made the temple so great in Jesus' day. You see all the political intrigue that starts to take place when you understand the breadth of the story? And so these zealots, the real white right-wingers of Jesus' day, they couldn't stand it because King Herod being in charge, he was one of these people that had always hated and persecuted the Jews. Well, you're going to find out as we go a little bit further in the story why those zealots felt that way about Edomites, because this Doeg guy, he's an Edomite. He's a non-Jew that's in the employ of the Jewish king, and he's got an agenda. He's watching what David's doing in this scene. Now remember, Psalm 52, what did I say? It was a contemplation from David about what this guy Doeg did. So we don't get to hear David's thoughts and commentaries about this guy Doeg here in the story. We have to go all the way to Psalm 52 later on. So here we've been in Leviticus 24, we've been in Matthew 12, we're in 1 Samuel, and we're going to end up reading Psalm 52 to get the entire picture of what's happening here in your biblical text. They happen hundreds, if not 1,000 years apart, all of them, and yet they weave one consistent story. Do you understand what I'm doing? Okay? So the priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other except that one here." And David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." Now, David was intimately familiar with this sword because after he killed Goliath with a sling and a stone, let us not forget that he, as a 15-year-old kid, walked up to this sword, yanked it out of its gigantic scabbard, hefted it above his head, cut off Goliath's head with it, and then picked up Goliath's head by the hair and ran around telling the rest of Israel, "Look what I did." That's why David was uniquely equipped to say, there's no sword like that. The sword was so big that even as a full-grown guy, David had to walk around on that thing on his back. It would have looked like something out of science fiction. No way David could handle that. So then David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? So now David's in another place, and he says, "Oh gosh, I'm recognized again. Will they tell Saul that I'm here?" And verse 12 says, "Now David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, 'Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?'" Chapter 22. David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. So this whole time, David's been trying to find a place to hide that's safe from Saul. He makes up a black op mission because he's afraid the police will report him. He's trying to protect his family because they're all at the very verge of being slaughtered. He gets to this other place and he just turns himself into a raving, complete lunatic in the face of this king so that the king would not see him as an enemy, but as a stupid buffoon. This would make an awesome movie. Verse 2 of 1 Samuel 22 says, and everyone who was in distress, now you're going to begin to see this themes that we had from first session come into here. Everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain, and the Gibson International Translation says he became captain over a bunch of losers and rejects. And there were about 400 men with him. Anybody who had a problem, you want to talk about the words on the Statue of Liberty, give us your weary, give us your lonely, give us your battered, your tired masses, yearning to breathe free. David was like, yeah, that. And also, if you don't have any money too, that'd be great. I got enough bread. I'll figure out how to feed you. The moral of this story, though, if we take pause out from what I'm trying to tell you today, the moral of the story is this: just because you are down doesn't mean you are out. Just because you are distressed, just because you are anxious, just because you are afraid, you get close to the man of God, you get close to a relationship with God, you do the things we talked about in the previous session when we read through John 13, 14, 15, 16. You obey God so that Jesus can manifest himself to you in your life. He can take you from a down and out loser to a mighty man of valor who goes on to do great. These are the men that later on in the days when David's life is waning, that the book recounts the heroic exploits that they do. Even though then it gives them their names and it says what they do and who they killed and how they hunted down the giant's brothers and all this kind of stuff, these losers are those guys. Then David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and my mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me. So he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Why was David able to go down to the king of Moab? Well, his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma was a Moabitess. Now the prophet Gad said to David, do not stay in this stronghold. Depart and go to the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Now we switch perspectives. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah, and his spear in his hand and all his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, you Benjamites. That's Saul's tribe. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. That's David's father, by the way. And there is not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day. He's yelling at all of his lackeys. Not one of you have found this guy. And look who steps up to the plate. Verse 9. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, give him provisions, and give him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, hear now, son of Ahitub. He answered, here I am, my lord. Then Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day? Now, of course, David has done nothing to Saul. David hasn't attempted to overthrow Saul. Saul is acting out of absolute jealousy in the prophecies that the Lord was going to take the kingdom out of his hands. But David never did a thing to him. It says, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to anything in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much. And now you can begin to see that David told his story not so much to lie and to protect himself, but to protect this priest from getting into trouble. And the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. Then the king said to the guards who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me." But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, "You turn and kill the priests." So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests, and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod, the mark of the priest. Also Nob, the city of the priests, not only did he kill all of them that showed up to where the king was at, Doeg took that authority, went back to Nob, the city of those priests. He struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. And now the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled to David. One son gets out. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. So David said to Abiathar, "I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe.'" Now, what a wretched story, and you can begin to see why Jews later on, they had a bad taste in their mouth for their Edomites, not just for this, but for things that happened many, many years before. But I want to go back as we wrap this one up, and I want to look at Psalms 52. Because we don't get to see David's real thoughts, that you can tell that he's grieved. In fact, he even takes the guilt for the death of this man's family, this man's city, his cousins, his neighbors, his friends, his children. He takes it on himself. But Psalm 52 says, to the chief musician, a contemplation of David, when Doeg the Edomite went and told Saul and said to him, "David has gone to the house of Ahimelech." These are David's thoughts from that day. And I think the things that he talks about are telling. But you see, if you didn't read Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 9, if you didn't read Matthew 12 and following to see Jesus bringing up this story, and you just went through and you just read the story in 1 Samuel, you would miss so much. And then by the time you actually got around to reading Psalms, you probably would never have made the connection to the story. David thinks about this man and he says, "Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteousness. You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, 'Here is the man who did not make God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise you forever because you have done it. And in the presence of your saints, I will wait on your name, for it is good.'" David wrote these words after Abiathar had come to him and told him these horrible things that had happened. What's interesting is the Bible doesn't tell us this, but the rabbinical midrash, the commentaries on the Old Testament written by Jewish rabbis, they have a theory that Doeg was himself a great and learned man, a great and learned scribe, and that one of the reasons that he turned so harshly was he acted out of a spirit of legalism. He saw David taking the showbread to feed his men. And just like the Pharisees didn't understand that God desired mercy instead of sacrifice, he was so offended that that's why he chose to betray David. in the midst, can you imagine the stress? I think we can all, we've talked about these things and stress and giving it over to God and handling that kind of stuff this morning. I think we can all safely say the destruction of an entire city, every man, woman, and child, has never been on our heads. We've never had to endure that type of guilt, that type of responsibility. The first thing David does is he said, buddy, I am going to take care of you for the rest of your life, because the man that seeks your life seeks my life, and as long as I'm alive, you will be safe. But all the evil things that he goes on to describe were part of the character of Doeg. Look what he says about himself at the end. He says, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. He's not saying I'm like a green olive tree, not a black olive tree. He's saying I am like a living olive tree. My wood is green. I'm alive. I am well. I am nurtured. Olives, yes, they were eaten, but they were also the source of the anointing oil that lit the lamps in the very holy place where the table of showbread existed. He's saying, I still have the Lord's anointing upon me. He says, I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise you forever because you have done it. You have delivered me. You brought me to a safe place. You've surrounded me with people that I can trust. He says, and in the presence of your saints. Who are the saints that you think he's talking about when he writes this? The presence of his saints are those down and out losers that at that moment in time felt like they might never amount to anything in God's kingdom, despite the promises that were already on their leader's life. And in the presence of your saints, I will wait on your name, for it is good. Even in the midst of that, I don't know about you, but if I had seen Saul send one of his lackeys to do that, I might have no longer been content to cut the hem off of his garment. I might have felt less remorse. I might have thought it's time to pin him to the wall with his spear as he tried to do to me, not for my sake, but for the justice that is deserved upon all of these other people. But no, David said, I'm going to let you do it your way, God. I'm going to obey your commandments, God. I'm not going to take it into my hands. I'm going to let you fulfill your prophecies over my life the way that you said you want to do it. I still belong to you, and you are going to be the one. You are going to be the one. And it is Doeg whose sin goes on to cause the death of Saul and Jonathan and Abner. God in the story goes on to avenge what happened there that day. And David takes his rightful place as the best king that Israel ever saw, because in the midst of that tragedy, in the midst of that anxiety, in the midst of that fear, in the midst of that incredibly horrible, depressing guilt for how that situation went down, David still said, not my way, but your way. That's who we have to be, my friends. That's how we have to live our lives. So, hopefully, that rabbit trail through the scriptures brings a story to life for you in a way that perhaps you've never seen it. When you read Samuel from now on, I hope that comes back to your mind. Let's close with prayer. Well, Father, I just thank you for the opportunity to explain and illumine portions of your word to your people to make it come to life. I pray that the practical applications that we take out of that allow us to humbly seek you doing things your way in our lives, and to always remain in submission to what you have for us, no matter how hard or illogical it may even seem. But God, I pray also that seeing how your word ties together builds and fosters an excitement in your people to find the other stories that seem weird and look for the places that cross-reference and tie together to begin to unpack the beauty that is the integrated message system that is your word. If you, Holy Spirit, put that desire in all of us, you will make us all greater disciples. And we thank you for it in Jesus' name. Well, the offering is in the back. As always, be cheerful givers. Give unto the Lord. And we will be back next week, moving forward in the various things that we've been studying. I will cover the ground that I said I would last Circle Sunday to review some of those materials for everyone. And then we'll be back in Revelation chapter 4 and chapter 5. So we love you. Go with God. If you have any questions, you know how to reach out. Thanks.